Planet's on fire, it's a real code red. Got us by the balls, we're being slowly bled. All the swollen puppet head, propagandized. Big chocolate points, flat outlines. A house full of mirrors, it's a lousy reflection. Run hard left, it's a true direction. Democracy's in trouble, this news isn't fake. Everything we fought for is truly at stake. Border to border, coast to coast, it's time to cue the talent and meet our host. It's a podcast by George. All right, folks, it's showtime.
It's showtime indeed. Thanks again, Bob Pace, for that outstanding intro. Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Going to be talking about the top tier of the big three: climate, war, and healthcare. That's what we talk about a lot on Podcast by George. And today it's something that we need to talk about more, folks, because it's looming large. The wolf is at the doorstep. Things are bad and they're getting worse. We're going to be talking about not climate change. We're going to be talking about climate catastrophe. It's underway. It's getting worse, and it's going to get really bad. So, yeah, that's what I want to talk about today. And we got a guest today that you're just going to love. I'm going to put this up on screen. That's our live line guest. It's Rory Varrato. He's an advanced doctoral student in the philosophy and education program at Teachers College, Columbia University, and has worked as an adjunct professor of philosophy at Fordham University, a graduate student instructor at Teachers College, and a course assistant at New York University, also Arizona State University. My God, this guy's really smart, folks. I tell people all the time, I got a bachelor's degree, but I basically bought my way out of Drake University. I don't know how these people do all this stuff. He's appeared with heroes of mine, Jimmy Dore, Lee Camp, Chris Hedges, folks like that. He's also been quoted in mainstream media outlets such as Bloomberg and the Washington Post. We've got a little photo essay I'm going to show here from the Washington Post very shortly. He served as media liaison for Extinction Rebellion, New York City. Now, that's a group that he co-founded in 2018. So he's in the green room right now. Let me take that down. I want to start with, I mentioned Lee Camp, the fact that, as a matter of fact, I saw Rory just recently on Lee Camp's show. And I've had this book before. Matter of fact, here's my copy. This is let me get it over here. There it is. There's Lee's book, and you can see it on screen there. I've had Lee on my show before, and I like to read this particular page in particular when it comes to the climate. And I'm going to have to bring this up on the screen full size here to be able to read this, I think, because this is kind of small, folks, but for my old eyes. Okay, so the highlighting is mine. It says, I just don't mean there should be a report every couple of hours about climate change by our bloviating bullhorns of mainstream news. I don't mean once a day you should mention to a friend that Al Gore seems vaguely douchey, but probably has a point. I mean, climate change should be all we're thinking about. It should be a major factor in every conversation, every job, every TV show, every humor column, every tweet, every clever t-shirt slogan, hello Reagan, and every fortune cookie message. Climate change should be everything. Lee says that plastic action figures for kids should have one arm melted off to symbolize the effects of climate change. Your server at a nice restaurant should sprinkle sand in your soup du jour to remind you of the disappearance of fresh water. Ice cream should be exclusively served melted to symbolize rising temperatures. Hamburgers should cost $200 to compensate for the global emissions of factory farming. Hello, Heartland. And every time you go ice skating, oh man, I'm a hockey guy, someone should punch you in the face and yell, enjoy it while it lasts. We have less than a second left. Simply put, humans have no business going about our day-to-day activities as if we weren't on the event horizon. It's equivalent to working on your model train set while your kitchen is burning down. Your spouse is in the bathroom battling an alligator that's taken up residence in the bathtub, and your 12-year-old daughter is in the living room having just been offered heroin for the first time. But sadly, here to wrap that up, he says, right now, humankind seems to be fixated, I would say, on the model train set. I just can't say it any better than that. And really like Lee Camp. Okay, so before we bring Rory in, I want to kind of lay the groundwork here. Um, I particularly in my age set, a lot of people are moving out again because of COVID, but it's still out there. I mean, COVID is still killing people, lots of them. We're going to have Dr. Andrew Nish on tomorrow to talk about that. But one of the things they just can't wait to do is start to cruise. They want to get out and see the world. Okay, I saw this photo essay in the Washington Post. So here we go. Let's tour the world. Let's save the money on the cruise and the COVID infection and take a look at this from WAPO. Wildfires, floods, typhoons, 24-hour photos show the climate change threat. So, and we go through here. This one's in Pakistan. I've got a film clip. We may get to that. I hope that you saw this. I hope that this struck a chord with you the way that it did with me. That flooding in Pakistan, that was like something that's never been seen before. It was biblical. And, a lot of people don't seem to give a shit about Pakistan, but this is coming to a neighborhood near you. It already has in parts of the United States. And the flooding, when it occurs, is unbelievable. That was Pakistan. This is in South Korea. This is the result of a typhoon. Let's keep going here. Oh, this also is in South Korea. I saw this. Oh, my God. These people drowned in a parking garage. Okay. I mean, I can't swim, number one. Number two, man, I don't want to drown, and I don't want to drown in a parking garage. But that's what's happening. This is in Thailand. I know a lot of people have toured and gone to Thailand. Yemen, this really jumped out at me because Yemen should be in the news more than it is because of that genocide and all of that killing that the U.S. has had a role in for many years in Yemen. Look what happened to them. Again, flooding there. And you think, well, I'll just stay home. I'll be safe. I'll tour the good old U.S. of A. Folks, this is California. One of the most popular, if not the most popular vacation destinations in the United States. It is on fire. The Western United States is burning up. And then China, you've been reading a lot about China in the news politically. This is a landslide. What a photo that is. That's from China Daily, and Reuters picked that up. But anyway, that's what's going on around the world. Let me get that off screen here, and I can't wait to bring Rory in here. Let's get him in because that's a little longer intro than I like to get going when I have a guest coming on in here. Rory Varrato, welcome to a podcast by George Liveline.
Hi, George. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on in here. That's kind of my starting point to show how bad this is getting, and I'm perplexed at how little people seem to care sometimes. And I know this is your whole world, and that has a lot to do with the name of the organization that you're so involved with, Extinction Rebellion. It really depresses and shocks me in some ways. Do you see that there's increasing awareness or not when it comes to this situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's both increasing awareness, but sort of depressing in the lack of corresponding action, right? And I also just want to mention up front here that although I have been highly involved with Extinction Rebellion and I'm a co-founding member, I don't want to present myself as sort of speaking for the group. It's decentralized, and each of us is perfectly able to speak for ourselves. But as a person in the world, I suppose, who happens to be involved with Extinction Rebellion and having seen its sort of rise and been involved with its rise over the past few years, I'm very proud of the impact that it's had on the global conversation. And I do think that awareness has increased significantly, of course, in conjunction with other sort of concomitant climate efforts, especially by figures like Greta Thunberg and others who have risen to prominence in the past few years. So yes, awareness is increasing, I think, but at the same time, we're sort of confronted with, as I mentioned, this inaction and indeed continued sort of worsening or exacerbation of the climate crisis by the very people and institutions that have brought us to this point in the first place.
Well,
And so it's very disheartening, I have
it
to
is
admit.
disheartening. It's shocking. And I could put up on screen these photos of Lake Mead and the Colorado River, but this may get to me more than anything. People don't seem to realize, they don't have any conceptualization. What happens when California runs dry? I mean, that's an exaggeration, maybe a little bit, but maybe
Mm.
not. The Western
Well,
United States is running out of water. Has anyone even projected what that could possibly mean for this country and the world if that happens? And I think significant portions of California could be running out of water in just the next few years.
absolutely. Yeah, I think this is much more immediate than people seem to realize, and
Yes.
I think a big part of that, to sort of speak to your confusion as to why this is not being recognized as the emergency that it is that we live in a profoundly ahistorical society. The United States is not only deeply anti-intellectual and ignorant from top to bottom, but I would say almost uniquely, it's extraordinarily ahistorical. We have no conception of history and its bearing, the past's bearing on the present. And so, for example, I lived in Arizona for 10 years before I moved to New York City, so I'm familiar with the sort of ethos there. I've seen the endless fields of golf courses in Scottsdale, where I lived and taught for a few years, that should not exist in the Sonoran Desert. And if you know anything about the history of that region, there were indigenous peoples who lived and flourished there in Arizona in the Sonoran Desert for quite a long time. They built, in fact, the most advanced pre-industrial system of canals for irrigation. And then suddenly in the early 14th century, they essentially disappeared. I'm speaking of the Hohokam here, and to a lesser extent, other ancestral Pueblans in the region. And the reason for that is because there was a great drought, what's called the Great Drought, which took place over a period of about 25 years at the end of the 13th century. So in the face of that, this thriving indigenous population almost disappeared over the following 50 years. So history is, the famous sort of quote attributed to Mark Twain: history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. This is coming to pass now in Arizona and probably in parts of California as well. And we see it being played out over this sort of renegotiation for water rights of the Colorado River, right? As if we can sustain, Phoenix, for example, the metropolitan area of Phoenix, a city that simply should not exist, climatologically speaking, as if we can somehow find a way to just divide a couple gallons, here and there in the rapidly diminishing Colorado River to keep this alive. It's not going to happen, in my view. I think we're going to see a sudden sort of collapse and exodus that mirrors the collapse of the Hohokam that happened almost 1,000 years ago.
You mentioned Phoenix. Let's strike fear or dread in the terror in the hearts of some of my friends, and even my dad. My God, Las Vegas. My God,
Yes.
what in the hell is that all about? I mean, and I don't know. They've got some water restriction there, I think, don't they, or not?
Yes, I don't know exactly. I'm not super informed on the current state of water regulation in Las Vegas. I will say that my great uncle was a water manager at Lake Mead for decades over the course of his career, and I remember him speaking 20 years ago, being deathly worried about the decline of Lake Mead. This was 20 years ago, so.
Yeah.
We see where it's at now. We see the pictures. We see the sort of watermark and how deeply the
Yes.
water has receded. So Las Vegas is another city that should not exist, and we have to begin thinking in these terms. I made this similar argument actually when I testified alongside many other people in front of the New York City Council. I think in the summer of 2019. When Extinction Rebellion New York and several other groups had been pressuring the council to pass a climate emergency resolution. And we successfully, through a combination of protest and lobbying and things like this, we successfully pressured them into passing, of course, a non-binding climate emergency, but it was significant. And we helped them to write the language of that bill at the time. And it's quite a decent declaration. But as I say, I remember testifying, and I only had 2 minutes or whatever to speak. But part of the argument that I tried to, communicate to these people is the urgency for us to consider creative and novel options. For example, thinking about Manhattan itself as a sinking ship that we need to abandon and relocate from, like now. Not tomorrow, not 10 years from now, whatever. Like, we have to begin this process now. We're in a sinking ship. And that's, Manhattan's not unique in that case, but we have a very dense and highly concentrated population, and we have enormous wealth. And of course, they're planning on building seawalls around the financial district in lower Manhattan to protect Wall Street. But what about the Bronx? What about Brooklyn? Anyway, that's...
Well, as I mentioned, folks, I saw Rory on Lee Camp's show, but I also saw this article in Truth Out. I want to bring this up on screen, and Rory, you can jump in here anytime you want to.
Sure.
The federal government's recent announcement that it would impose significant cutbacks in water allocations to the 7 states reliant on water from the drought-stricken Colorado River that we were talking about is the latest sign that climate change is ravaging global water systems. Now, Arizona will lose more than 20% of its water allocation, and Nevada 8%. Northern Mexico, which is also reliant on the Colorado River, that's kind of where it runs dry, I think, and has been provided 1.5 million acres per feet of water per year from the river since a water sharing treaty between the two countries was signed in 1944, is being hit hard as well, with a 7% reduction in its water allocation from the river. Now, this is what Rory was talking about. 30 indigenous tribes, which have land in the Colorado Basin, and which, as a result of a 1908 Supreme Court decision, have water rights from rivers running through their territories, are also preparing for a more arid future. Some are cutting back their water contributions to state reservoirs. Others, in a letter to the Department of the Interior, have noted that they aren't being adequately consulted on fundamental decisions regarding water usage and distribution in the region. Surprise, surprise. I mean, the indigenous were, shuttled onto these reservations. They were put out into these areas. Now they're being starved, and the water's being denied. This is insult to injury is what I call it on the show. In Europe, much of the continent is facing its worst drought in half a millennium, with water levels on rivers like the Danube so low that sunken World War II ships are being exposed above the waterline. Major hydroelectric generators in France, Italy, and Spain are seeing drops in electricity production 30% this summer. Again, if you think about the trend line here, they're seeing drops. They're going to see possibly the inability to create this hydroelectric power that so much of Europe is relying upon. Like I talked about with California and that mass exodus, which seems to be looming, at least to me anyway, Rory. What happens when some of this stuff occurs? My God, this migration issue is something that is really hard to contemplate.
Indeed, it is. And we're seeing it, we have been seeing it globally for some time, whether that's refugees from Africa and Asia fleeing to Europe, or refugees from Central and Southern America, South America, coming northward into the United States. But in some sense, we've been insulated here in the United States. Although for sure, we forget about the folks already in Puerto Rico, for example, who were devastated by hurricane not long ago, or, arguably the city of New Orleans and the people in Louisiana broadly who were displaced and devastated by Katrina nearly 20 years ago. So for sure, this, I think, is the humanitarian crisis that is most imminent and perhaps will be most disruptive in the short term, these mass migrations, because it's a matter of life and death for people, right? Indeed, I would argue that, the whole idea of building the wall that Trump was advocating for, and I should say Hillary Clinton as well, right? The Democrats and Republicans are a uniparty. That itself is a function of an expression of the recognition of climate catastrophe and its human impacts, right? People are fleeing northward, and so we've got to keep them out. It's going to get worse. But one sort of question implicit in what you raised, I think, is where do the people in the United States go? Where do the people in Florida go, for example, when these things begin to happen? I'm not sure we have a clear answer to that, other than to recognize that given the political polarization in this country, it's not going to be pretty, these relocations and exoduses from uninhabitable regions. It's a frightening prospect.
Well, here's something that I wanted you to talk about because a lot of, I don't know if they're oligarchy necessarily, but the privileged class in America, they've avoided a lot of the hardship that's always been around. I mean, it's been ongoing in so many areas of society for so many years, so many decades, really hasn't affected them. But I heard you talking about the fact, hey, your money ain't going to save you. Not this time. This is something that your money will not do you any good. The other part of it is your political proxies, your pals, and in politics, they ain't going to save you either. Talk about that.
Absolutely. I mean, this is sort of the nexus of climate or environment and politics that perhaps interests me most, because politics, sometimes we forget because we live in a totalitarian society here in the United States where the average individual has and can have essentially no impact, no meaningful impact on the political process. But politics is meant to be a participatory thing that involves everyone and that is action guiding, right? Essentially, who gets what and how when we're talking about resources, policies, etc. But the sort of United States, the system that has emerged in the United States, which I really like, as you saw on that recent live stream I did with Lee Camp, we discussed inverted totalitarianism. It's a concept that was put forth by Sheldon Wolin. And he basically articulated this as a way to capture the historically unique essence of this new totalitarianism in the United States. So living in that system, it's administered by these, I would say, in many cases, psychopathic and or sociopathic oligarchs who have distanced themselves from the effects that their policies produce on not just the population, but on the world writ large, including the environment. And that has been the case perhaps for the last 100 years, let's say, the broad prosperity and increasing concentration of wealth throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. But it's rapidly dissolving, I think. And I think actually one of the grim ironies here is that these oligarchs are, I would say that they have been aware of this for some time, at least some significant portion of them. Look at the research that Exxon was producing about climate change decades ago, for example. Yeah, that has come to light. But increasingly, they are becoming, as a class, self-aware and publicly articulating that awareness in their, media outlets. Like I recall about 4 or 5 years ago, there was an article in the New Yorker about doomsday bunkers, billionaire bunkers, right, in New Zealand and elsewhere. So they're prepping, although in the general culture, preppers, so-called, have been derided and dismissed as conspiracy theorists or whatever. But these folks are prepping. They know that they're not insulated from the consequences that are coming. But I think they are still deceiving themselves that they can kind of isolate or ride it out. But I don't think that's possible. I think it misunderstands the deep interconnections that exist, whether they want to recognize it or not, between themselves and the lower classes that they exploit and oppress. They're not going to escape this unscathed, unfortunately for them.
Well, you know who else knows it's coming, and this is widely known: the military. I mean, they're making plans. They're prepping, as you call it. And this is something that I've put forth. It makes me depressed because it just isn't realistic. I think one of the most immediate, one of the most beneficial things that we could do for the climate tomorrow would be to close about half of these 800 military bases that we have ringing the planet. The military, the U.S. military, is the largest institutional polluter and contributor to greenhouse gases, as I understand it, in the world. These bases are unnecessary at best. And of course, they're blowing up people all over the planet. But I think, okay, that sounds good, but is there any appetite for that? I had a guy on my show not too long ago, Rory, a climate activist, and he was talking about a carbon tax, which sounds good as a means of addressing climate. But I kind of looked at the guy and thought, what, the Democrat or the Republican parties are going to impose a carbon tax on their donors? How realistic is that? So I don't know. Are either one of those scenarios realistic in your mind?
Well, probably not realistic. I think good and desirable, right? Both the deconstruction and dismantling of the U.S. war machine, which, as you point out, is the largest non-nation state carbon emitter on the planet. And indeed, if it were taken as a nation state, it would rank about 42nd, I think, among other nations, somewhere around Peru, if I recall correctly. So absolutely, dismantling that horrific institution would be a great stride forward in addressing the climate crisis. But of course, that won't happen, and it really can't happen absent something extraordinary like a genuine revolution that overthrows the United States government, because the United States government is predicated on not just genocide, historically, genocide of indigenous peoples, for example, and enslavement of Black people, but in the industrial and post-industrial era, predicated on petro-imperialism. And indeed, the entire global capitalist world system depends on the continued extraction and consumption of fossil fuels. It's not optional. And so, for example, we had in, I think, the last Democratic presidential primary, we had Elizabeth Warren, who's a joke, in my opinion, and, pretended to be indigenous herself for political gain. She was talking about greening the military, as if that's a laudable goal. But more importantly, it's just not feasible. And we can get into the nuts and bolts in that. It's controversial, but that's my position, that we can't actually transition. We can't sort of maintain the infrastructure that we have and simply switch to renewable or sustainable resources to power that infrastructure. We have to actually actively dismantle and replace with something else, including by simply reducing our energy usage altogether, that infrastructure. So no, the military will not go anywhere. And I would expect, actually, if we look at the history of imperial decline and decay, we will continue to see the United States military expend itself, essentially, to the point of fizzling out and collapsing, much like the Romans and others have done throughout human history, because there will be a certain desperation that will set in. It reminds me of something I just want to mention. I read in a book from Robert J. Lifton a few years ago, who is a great psychiatrist and political activist and
hitting the wall. Yeah.
What's that?
Hitting the wall. That's what I think of when I think of Lifton, right? He was the guy that talked about the fact that we're hurtling headlong into a wall, basically. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And he was a proponent of nuclear disarmament. It was a big cause throughout his career. And he wrote this book a few years ago called The Climate Swerve, where he was saying, look, there is this wall that we're about to hit, or cliff that we're about to go off, and we have to veer away from it as quickly as possible through concerted action. But he makes a point specifically about fossil fuels towards the end of that book that hopefully I can recall well enough to explain. I'll summarize. He simply says, he makes an analogy between slavery prior to the Civil War in the United States and the existence of fossil fuels underground in the present day. And he says, if we conceptualize these things in strictly economic terms, we think about the value, the wealth that was viewed by the Confederacy for slaves, right, institutionally, that was worth X amount of dollars. And for them, the cost of losing those versus going to war in order to save them, these stranded assets, was in favor of war. The same point holds for fossil fuels. These are resources that cannot be allowed by these corporations to become stranded It's against their financial imperative to do so, and they will agitate for every means necessary, up to and including war, as we're seeing arguably with the Ukraine situation, to extract and profit from those resources.
Well, here's the most depressing part of it for me, and I know Jimmy Dore and Lee Camp and people like that talk about it all the time, and we can't get into it today, but it's this petrodollar. It's this thing when the U.S. currency or the U.S. government went off the gold standard, propped up its currency with its own currency, and required that all of the oil be purchased from Saudi Arabia and the big oil producers be paid for in U.S. dollars. So basically, the extraction of fossil fuels that money is propping up our country, basically our currency, our finances. I mean, my God, how do we move away from that in time to save ourselves? That's I have this little analogy I use. People who watch my podcast, they hear me talk about it till they're probably sick of it, Rory. But I talk about the line in the movie Casino where Robert De Niro talks to the casino manager and says, you know, you're either too dumb or you're in on it, because that guy got 3 jackpots in a row. You can't work here. I mean, I don't know which of those two it is, but it's one or the other, and that means you're fired. You're out of here. That's what I would like to tell the government, the overlords in our country. Well, there's this. This is probably too dumb. I mean, look at this. I saw this article. This is out of the Denver Gazette. Drought threatens the future of Colorado's $20 billion ski industry. I looked at that and I thought, is this a joke? Listen to what Rory and I have been talking about, the potential impacts of this killer drought and the mass migration and people having to pack up and head somewhere. Millions of people out of California, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and places like this. Well, here's the thing that we need to be concerned about. You already talked about golf courses earlier. The $20 billion ski industry may be impacted. For a decade, the Colorado ski industry has enjoyed a little-known hedge against the Colorado River drought, a deal with Denver that allows resorts to borrow water rights when they are making snow in fall, so long as they return the snowmelt to the city's reservoir in the spring. I got to wonder whether or not that's ever happening. But as federal officials demand that the states along the Colorado River Basin conserve an additional 2 to 4 million acre feet of water in a 22-year drought, the delicate system is strained by impending water shortages after nearly a quarter century of drought. Okay, let's jump out of that and come back to Rory, because this is the too dumb or they in on it thing. When I see somebody writing about a 25-year-old drought, that ain't a drought, Rory. I'm an old farm boy. I mean, a drought might last a summer. I mean, it might last a couple of years if it's really severe. If you've got 25 years, you don't have a drought. You got a normal. I mean, that's the way things are. And you better come to realization real quick and try to do something about it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it reminds me, as I mentioned earlier, of the so-called Great Drought of the late 13th century, which was about, I think, 25 years as well. And as you say, you know, that's not just a blip on the radar. That's a completely sort of civilizationally redefining event. You know, but your sort of general point about how we seem, so many of us, and particularly those in positions of power and those with wealth and influence, seem to be so narrowly focused on the sort of horizon of our own personal lives, our individual lives and goals. I think that this is one of the biggest issues that we face in terms of organizing to take action to help mitigate the effects that have been coming, are coming, and will continue to be coming. And part of this is a result of, I'll borrow another phrase from Sheldon Walden. He has this great phrase that he uses, systematic derangement, the systematic derangement in the system, in the capitalist economy itself, where you have people incentivized to care, for example, about ski tourism in Colorado, when instead we have actual matters of life and death for thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, and I would argue billions of people that are unfolding before our very eyes. And so there's this profound alienation as well. The effects of the climate are so widespread over the entire planet. They're disaggregated. Climate change is what the philosopher Timothy Morton calls a hyper object. It's difficult for us many people to grasp intellectually because it's so diffuse, so spread out. It's this large network of patterns that are interconnected and overlapping, and that unfold over, a long period of time, at least in the context of a human life. But we're seeing those events coming more and more quickly, so that there is essentially no lull between them, right? It's sort of our new normal, as you mentioned, with regards to the drought. So one of my small hopes is that we will begin to internalize that, so that people will, hopefully somewhat spontaneously, as a result of events in their personal lives, recognize the reality simply by essentially looking out their window and seeing that we're fucked. It's not a mystery. It can't be denied unless, well, it can be denied, unfortunately, but you have to disbelieve your own eyes, essentially,
exactly
at this
right.
point.
Well, let me bring this up on screen because I love it when viewers make comments and ask questions. And this is something that you've dealt with a lot, Rory. I know this is from John Roberts. He's a viewer of my show. He says, my problem with Extinction Rebellion is this language of the left, like petro-imperialism. People on the right don't want a burning planet. Everybody uses oil. Can't there be a unifying message? And I get that. I want you to reply to this, Sir Roy. But what I would say is, and I've been talking to people about this, I see signs, yard signs still that say, just be nice. So I got news for you, folks. Well, we're bending over and being nice. These people are kicking us in the ass. They're kicking our ass off the astral plane. And I think about Bernie Sanders, and I've become greatly disillusioned with Bernie. People wonder why he can't do anything, why he can't take action. I tell people Bernie's he's a good old guy, but he's a pacifist, so much so that he won't even argue or take issue with people like Joe Biden hardly on a debate stage. That's not what we need. It is too imminent. The threat is upon us. And I don't think being nice is going to get us out of this. And that's not exactly what John is saying, but reply to his comment there, Rory.
Yeah, sure. I think this is an important issue to address. And I want to reiterate here, because of its sort of controversial nature, that in no way am I speaking for Extinction Rebellion here, just speaking for myself personally and as a person who does believe in Extinction Rebellion's purpose and mission. But for myself, and opinions are divided on this about messaging and trying to build unity, etc. Because yes, of course, I think any organism that cares for its own self-preservation would prefer that its habitat remain habitable. The reality is, for folks who, are more conservative or right-wing, is that you're wrong. They're simply wrong, and they must change themselves, I would argue, and come to the realization that there is no path forward that, for example, continues the existence of the capitalist order, which is fundamentally predicated upon imperialism and indeed petro-imperialism. So this is why for me, education is such a central component of this really species-wide transformation that we need to undertake. And I'm sure, I'm certain that John would, and others like that, would react negatively to what I'm saying, and that's fine. That's their prerogative. But my position is simply and emphatically that you are wrong. And I would love to have a conversation attempting to change your mind and to show you, because if we take on good faith that you do care about your life, your children's lives, your environment, other people on the planet, and I do believe that people like John are acting in good faith when they say these things. But unfortunately, the belief that a right-wing agenda can accomplish those goals is profoundly mistaken. And so the answer is not the Democrats. The answer is not the Tories or whatever. It's a working class socialist or communist eco-socialist revolution, in my view.
Well, here's what Extinction Rebellion would say. They believe that this is the solution, and this is what they're doing. I'm going to bring this up on screen, and then Rory and I will come right back.
Yes, I'm here. I'm now under arrest just recently for doing what I'm doing outside the Houses of Parliament. I'm doing it for Extinction Rebellion because we have no other choice. Climate change is going to affect us all. if you turn on your news and see what's happening in Pakistan right now, people are dying and people will continue to die, and there is an absolute injustice to that because it is the rich world which is responsible.
Extinction Rebellion! Extinction Rebellion! Extinction Rebellion!
Okay, so that video clip, that's outside of Parliament in the UK. That fellow, maybe you couldn't see that on the video very clearly, but he has put this like a bike lock apparatus around his neck, and he's putting himself chained to the gate there, basically, as a means of civil disobedience to try to get something done. The folks at Extinction Rebellion, of course, believe that that is where we have arrived, that this is the type of thing that we need to do right now. And we're not talking about, breaking into people's homes, starting riots, turning cars upside down, setting fires, that type of thing. But we're talking about doing the types of things, Rory, that they did when I was a young man to stop a war. The Vietnam War did not stop electorally. It didn't stop with petition writing. It didn't stop with memes, although they didn't have social media back then. It stopped with exactly what that guy is doing, and by people coming together to letting the overlords, as we talked about them, these politicians, Richard Nixon first and foremost, then we ain't going to take it anymore. And if you don't do something, we're coming for you. They did the same thing with FDR. I mean, that's what the New Deal was all about. I mean, this is the type of impetus. This is a kind of push that I think we need to have. Now, I don't know. Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was, a big part of the reason for why I got involved with Extinction Rebellion in the first place is because, I first heard of Extinction Rebellion as a result of an open letter that was published in The Guardian, signed by Noam Chomsky, among many others, supporting the vision that had been put forth by Extinction Rebellion's co-founders, Roger Hallam and Gail Bradbrook. And indeed, Roger Hallam wrote a sort of manifesto that he called Common Sense for the 21st Century, referencing Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, Common Sense, which helped to inspire the American Revolution, right? So I would suggest that there's this important synergy between sort of idealistic or ideational intellectual activity on the one hand, including even sometimes memes. I've even written an essay about the sort of subversive or revolutionary power of memes, because like any piece of art, they can communicate a powerful political message. Of course, sometimes they're just dumb pictures of cats or whatever, but sometimes they can really inspire people in certain ways. But then on the other hand is the direct action, right? Like that individual who had locked himself to the fence, like I myself have participated in most recently outside the entrance to the New York Times printing press here in Queens. Those actions, the theory of change, right, is that civil disobedience can sort of raise awareness and prompt people who are sympathetic to the cause to take action in their own lives. But that also, it can sort of directly pressure decision makers, these psychopaths that control the levers of power, into implementing policies that correspond to or agree with the demands put forth by the dissidents. In my view now, again, emphasizing my personal view here, I would sadly suggest that we have reached a bit of an impasse with Extinction Rebellion and other groups who have been taking these actions. We've been doing this for, going on 4 years now. And we've seen some successes, like I mentioned, the declaration of climate emergency by New York City, and other pieces of legislation at various levels that have been passed. But to your point about the urgency and the sort of scope of change and transformation that needs to occur, it's sadly not happening. And so I don't know that means, that the immediate change of course is to move from, for example, nonviolent action to violent action. I'm a pacifist in that sense. I'm not a violent person, but I am an historian, and I am aware that there are very few, if any, bloodless revolutions in human history. And the fact of the matter is, whether it's organized or disorganized violence is already occurring from the bottom up. Organized violence is occurring from the top down.
Yeah.
It's an asymmetrical warfare that's already being undertaken. And at some point, I suspect there will be organized violence from below, and perhaps in the United States context, in the sort of grand tradition of resistance to government overreach. It's a possibility that I see on the horizon.
Let me have you talk about this because I've heard you speak to this, which is people, and maybe this is a good way to kind of start to wrap up here, but we need to understand that we need to focus on something other than Donald Trump. We need to focus on something other than political horse races in the United States. And Rory was talking about memes. I really like this one. This is from the great Noam Chomsky. He said, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. Even encourage the more critical and dissident views. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presumptions of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of the debate. That's presuppositions. I know that word, folks. But anyway, that's Noam Chomsky. But this is what he's talking about. I think sometimes that we've got a spinning watch that's kind of taking our eye off the ball. I mean, those are some, maybe I shouldn't use these
Mixed metaphors.
axioms. Yeah, but mixed metaphors. But you know what I mean, Rory? I mean, I turn on the evening news, and my God, the CBS Evening News, watch it with Norma. The first 3 minutes of that, holy buckets, it's all about climate. It really is.
Right.
But then it devolves into this Trump thing. And if you watch the cable news shows, and they're not news shows, the cable news programs,
propaganda,
yeah, exactly. They're all about Trump and Mar-a-Lago and all this type of thing. And I'm like, people, my God, the world is coming to humanity anyway, is coming to an end here because of this climate situation. This is what we need to focus on, but they're distracting us, I think.
For sure. I mean, those outlets are, promulgated by large corporations that have financial incentives and interests in maintaining the status quo, and certainly in keeping the general population passive and disillusioned. Right? That's perhaps their most significant function. And so I agree, of course, with Chomsky on this point about the ways in which these, the sort of ultra megaphones that are used by these corporate so-called news outlets to shape debate, and especially to sort of subtly place the boundaries around the discussion of political issues. And indeed, I would say even our very moral imagination. Right, the capability for humans to imagine creative alternatives to what the present state of affairs that would actually be more successful at achieving or implementing our stated moral principles. All of these humanizing and philosophical elements are sort of dampened and destroyed by these outlets. So it reminds me, that Chomsky quote reminds me of another quote from a political theorist whose work I greatly admire and has been influential to me, Murray Bookchin, where he says the idea that what currently exists must necessarily exist is the acid that corrodes all visionary thinking. And we live in a time, because we're in this era, we're at this moment, actually, I should say, where the arc of our personal lives right now, those of us alive today, whatever your age is, the arc of our personal lives is intersecting in dramatic and disturbing and destructive fashion with the arc of Earth history, geological time. This is why I speak so much in my research and teaching about the Anthropocene, right? The Anthropocene, if you don't know, is our current geological epoch. And it's sort of pegged at different time periods, whether it's the dawn of the Industrial Revolution or the dropping of the first atomic bombs, which are registered in the very sediment of the Earth's crust itself, right? The fallout, the radioactive fallout from those droppings will persist long after humans disappear. But wherever we peg the beginning of this epoch at, the Anthropocene, it's characterized by the fact that human activity collectively is now the single most potent force on the planet, right? It's productive of climate change, resource depletion, mass extinction, et cetera, et cetera. And the effects and impacts that we're having on the planet, we're not immune to them. They're coming back on us right now through sort of the ultimate feedback loop. And I actually, you opened with that quote from Lee's book, which I think is a great quote. But Lee and I, in the days following my most recent appearance on his show, we've actually been having a little bit of a spirited back and forth over email about sort of whether or not one believes that there is the possibility to change course at this point. Lee, in that passage you quoted, says, we have very little time. We have 1 second. We should be thinking about this all the time. We should be acting all the time to try to change course. And I agree with that position. But unfortunately, my research has led me, through my understanding of the Anthropocene, the historical and ecological antecedents that underlie this moment in our personal and Earth histories, I have reached the regrettable conclusion, and I'm always seeking for dispositive evidence, or I'm always attempting to find something that can change my mind on this, that essentially it was too late, unfortunately, before I was born or you were born, before anyone watching was born, for us to change course. There's a certain thermodynamic inertia that is present in the burning of fossil fuels as a result of the Industrial Revolution that is going to unfold and play out no matter what we do right now. And it's productive of a possible, it's creating the Anthropocene extinction event right now, the Earth's 6th mass extinction right now. Humans are not immune to that. We're susceptible to it. We may very well go extinct in the near term, or quasi-extinct in the near term as a result of these effects. And so my position is essentially that we should soberly acknowledge that reality and focus on mitigation, recognizing also, importantly, that responsibility for this inertia that I referenced is not evenly distributed, right? There are historical actors who are much more responsible, corporate actors, nation states, that are much more responsible for these devastating consequences than, in many cases, the ones who are feeling those consequences most acutely. Look at Pakistan, look at the global South generally, right? The worst impacts are falling first and hardest on the folks who are least responsible for them. So we should bear that in mind as we try to really, I would use at this point the language of self-defense as we work to dismantle and destroy those institutions, structures, and even persons who are responsible for this ecocide and the possible end of advanced or complex human life on Earth. It's a dire moment, in my view.
God, yeah, that is dire. It is dark. I mean, the first step is to become more aware, obviously, to recognize what's happening. We've talked about that at great length. But the other thing is to, I think of the great Bob Dylan, don't trust leaders, watch your parking meters. I mean, that's the other part of this. I mean, we cannot rely on these political parties and these politicians to do the right thing. They're not doing it. But before we leave Rory here, I wanted to play this today, just almost for the entertainment value of it, the shocking morbidity, the entertainment value of this clip. I hope folks saw this. I first saw it, I think this was revealed really by Michael Tracy, who has been on my podcast before. He had this on Twitter. I want folks to take a look at this. These are the types of leaders that we're relying on to save us. I don't think so. Let me bring this clip on screen, and we'll come right back and say goodbye to Rory right after this. Watch this. Honest to God, this is something else.
Now, look, here's another question. One of the first things, and very briefly if I could, one of the first things that will happen when and if you become Prime Minister, you'll be ushered into a room very privately at number 10. will be laid out in front of you, what are called the letters of last resort, your orders to our Trident boat captain on whether you, Prime Minister Liz Truss, is giving the order to unleash our nuclear weapons. It would mean global annihilation. I won't ask you, would you press the button? You will say yes. But faced with that task, I would feel physically sick. How does that thought make you feel?
I think it's an important duty of the Prime Minister. I'm ready to do that.
I asked how it would make you feel.
I'm ready to do it.
Okay, that's your answer. Liz Truss, thank you for those answers. Ladies and gentlemen, Liz Truss.
Ladies and gentlemen, Liz Truss, that's the new Prime Minister of the UK. You heard Rory talk just a little bit ago about psychopaths. You're looking at one, folks. I mean, honest God, a couple of things jump out there at you. Again, this is a politician that refuses to answer the question as it was posed. He wanted to know how she would feel. She just volunteered, jumped ahead a step, a millennium maybe, by saying, hell, she can't wait to push the button. The other part about that that's shocking, that goes into this dire, dark area that Rory was talking about, is the audience. My God, those people are applauding that. They should be booing, hooting, carrying on like they do in the House of Commons, whistling. You know, you would expect no, they're cheering that. I don't know, Rory, to me, that was jaw-dropping.
Yes, yeah, I want to comment on that briefly. You know, that you see, she's almost like a soulless automaton in that moment. Just saying, completely dispassionate and saying, well, you know, I'll do what I have to do or whatever. Like, no human emotion at all visible on her face. And it speaks, I think, to the profound distance between both the ruling class and the structures of government that they control from the lived experience of the mass bulk of humans on this planet, right? The use of nuclear weapons should be viewed as perhaps the single most horrifying thing that has been done and that could be done in human history. And she's very sort of cavalier and casual about that. It reminds me actually of sort of this story that was going around a couple of years ago, 2017, actually, you know, prior to the conflict in Ukraine that's unfolding. William Perry, the Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, he had been in the Department of Defense for many decades. He's like 90 years old. He was going around saying, things are more dangerous now than at any point during the Cold War with regards to nuclear catastrophe. This was 2017. He was horrified, terrified, etc., and was trying to raise the alarm. And it's only gotten much worse since then. You know, you can look at the doomsday clock from the Bullet of Atomic Scientists. That's now at 100 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been. And the thing that struck me in Perry's comments and just in my own observation goes back to this issue of moral imagination I referenced earlier, and the seeming and ahistorical nature of American culture and political discourse. There's seemingly little, and global discourse, really, neoliberal discourse, as we just saw with Truss there, the seeming lack of familiarity with the actual reality of what nuclear war would look like.
God, and these are the people that we're going to count on. These are the people that we're going to rely on, not to prevent climate catastrophe, as Rory points out, but to mitigate it so that a lot of us survive anyway. Well, I kind of hate to leave it on such a downer note. I don't know, Rory, give us a closer here. Give us a wrap up. Maybe some advice that you would give to people based on your knowledge, experience, your readings, your understanding of history. And if there's any positive hope for this at all, give us a wrap up here.
Yes. I mean, I think there is, I don't know how I feel about the word hope at this point, but there is, there is space for positive and compassionate action at this juncture in world history. And I think first and foremost, it should take place in our personal lives. Try and focus on getting a grip on the reality of this situation in a way that doesn't leave you depressed and immobilized. Many times people will go through sort of a dark night of the soul with regards to climate awareness and and ecological awareness, and that's fine. But my concern is that sometimes it veers into a permanent nihilism. And although the situation is grim, we don't want to get stuck there. There is meaningful mitigation that can be done. Although arguably millions or perhaps even billions will die as a result of things like mass famines this century, there is still cause for action in the attempt to preserve and maximize the preservation of life in general. It could be the difference, between losing and saving tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people. That's not nothing. And it begins in our personal lives. It begins with caring about our neighbors, our family, and trying to build parallel institutions, networks of mutual aid, really withdrawing into the local and recognizing that we're not in our little bubbles. We're not alienated in the ways that we have perhaps felt in the times of petro-prosperity, so to speak, over the last several decades. There is consolation in solidarity, I think, and there is reason to believe that we can have a meaningful impact in our own personal lives and in the global scene through taking these kinds of actions in the present.
Words of wisdom, and he's a smart guy, folks. That's Rory Varrato. Just delighted to have him on the podcast by George Live Line. Rory, we'll leave it there. We'll come back again because this is something everybody needs to be aware of. And, I titled this Famine, Fire, and Floods Facing Us. And I would say here in closing, don't look at those clips like in Pakistan and think, that's, some third world area. That's Pakistan. No, that's coming to a neighborhood near you. That's what's going to happen. We need to act now. Rory, thanks again, pal. We'll circle back.
Thanks, George.
Yeah, that's Rory Varrato, folks. I mean, he's just great. And, the thing of it is, and I'll take him off screen here and tell people, if you like to see people like Rory Varrato on Podcast by George, the way that I always leave it here at the end is go to podcastbygeorge.com. And I've got a little clip of what this looks like. Let me see if I can bring this up on the screen here and show you what this particular slide looks like. Podcastbygeorge.com, the homepage here. Where are you? Okay, let's see if I'm going to be able to bring that up. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so if you go to podcastbygeorge.com, you will find you'll find that circled area there. Those are the icons, the badges that you need to poke one of those, and you will go to the platform that you want to get your podcast and your PBG on. For instance, Facebook and YouTube, that's where you'll see the video. And then, of course, on Stitcher and Deezer and iTunes and places like that, that's where you will find the audio versions, and they will notify you each time that a new edition of Podcast by George releases. But that is going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more, folks. That's another podcast by George.